The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying with it the bitter chill of winter. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling all sound except for the occasional crunch of footsteps. An elderly man, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, trudged through the snow. His name was Henry, a retired wildlife photographer who had spent most of his life in these woods. Today, he was out checking his old camera traps, hoping to capture some footage of the local wildlife. As he moved deeper into the forest, something caught his eye. A dark shape lying motionless near a tree. At first, he thought it was a fallen log, but as he got closer, his heart sank. It was a bear, a massive grizzly, tied up with thick ropes. Its fur was matted with snow, and its breathing was shallow. The ropes had cut into its skin, leaving raw, bloody marks. Henry's hands trembled as he approached, unsure if the bear was alive or dead. He knelt beside the creature, his breath visible in the freezing air. The bear's eyes flickered open, and for a moment they locked onto Henry's. There was no aggression, only pain and exhaustion. Henry's mind raced. Who would do something like this, and why? He knew he couldn't leave the bear here. It would freeze to death. But helping a wild grizzly was dangerous, even for someone with his experience. With a deep breath, Henry pulled out his pocket knife and began cutting the ropes. The bear flinched but didn't move, as if it understood he was trying to help. One by one, the ropes fell away, and Henry stepped back, watching the bear carefully. It struggled to its feet, swaying slightly before collapsing again. Henry's heart ached. He couldn't just walk away now. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and the snow was falling harder. He looked at the bear, then at the path ahead. "All right, big guy," he muttered. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Henry knew he couldn't carry the bear, but he had to do something. He glanced around, his mind racing for a solution. Nearby, he spotted an old wooden sled he'd used years ago to haul equipment. It was buried under snow, but it was still intact. With a grunt, he dug it out and dragged it over to the bear. "This is going to be tough, big guy," Henry said, more to himself than the bear. He wrapped his scarf around the bear's injured leg to stop the bleeding, and then, using all his strength, managed to roll the massive creature onto the sled. The bear groaned softly but didn't resist. Henry's muscles burned as he pulled the sled through the snow, the weight of the bear making every step a struggle. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. Henry's cabin was still a mile away, and the snowstorm was getting worse. He could barely see a few feet ahead, but he kept moving, driven by the thought of the bear's suffering. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a low growl that wasn't coming from the bear on the sled. He froze, his heart pounding. Through the swirling snow, he saw glowing eyes staring back at him. A wolf, then another. A pack had surrounded him, their teeth bared, their breath steaming in the cold air. Henry's mind raced. He had no weapons, and the wolves were too close for him to run. The bear on the sled stirred, letting out a weak growl of its own. The wolves hesitated, their eyes flicking between Henry and the bear. In a desperate move, Henry grabbed a stick from the ground and waved it at the wolves, shouting as loudly as he could. "Get out of here! Go!" The wolves backed away slightly but didn't leave. Henry knew he was running out of time. Then something unexpected happened. The bear on the sled let out a deep, rumbling roar that echoed through the forest. The sound was weak, but still powerful enough to startle the wolves. They turned and disappeared into the trees, their tails between their legs. Henry let out a shaky breath, his legs trembling with relief. He looked down at the bear, who was panting heavily from the effort. "You just saved us both," Henry said, patting the bear's side gently. "Let's get you to safety before anything else happens." He continued pulling the sled, his energy renewed by the close call. But as he trudged through the snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, but all he saw was the endless white of the storm. When he finally reached his cabin, he was exhausted. He dragged the sled inside, where the warmth of the fire began to thaw the bear's frozen fur. Henry quickly grabbed some blankets and wrapped them around the bear, then boiled water to clean its wounds. As he worked, he noticed something strange. A small metal tag attached to the bear's ear. It was scratched and dirty, but he could just make out a number engraved on it. His stomach churned. This wasn't just a wild bear. Someone had tagged it, which meant it had been captured before. Henry's mind raced with questions. Who had done this? Why had they tied up the bear and left it to die? And why did they tag it? He knew he couldn't rest until he found answers. But for now, his priority was saving the bear. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the small cabin. The bear lay on the floor, wrapped in blankets, its breathing steadier now. Henry sat beside it, carefully cleaning the wounds on its legs. The metal tag on the bear's ear glinted in the firelight, a constant reminder of the mystery surrounding the creature. As Henry worked, his thoughts kept returning to the wolves. Their sudden appearance and the bear's reaction had been strange. It was almost as if the bear had known what to do to scare them off. But how? Bears and wolves didn't usually interact like that in the wild. He shook his head, trying to focus. The storm outside was still raging, and the cabin felt like the only safe place in the world. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still out there, waiting. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest covered in a thick layer of snow. Henry stepped outside to gather more firewood, his breath visible in the crisp air. As he walked toward the woodpile, he noticed something unusual: footprints in the snow. They were large, too big to be a wolf's, and they led straight to his cabin. His heart skipped a beat. Someone had been here last night watching him. He followed the footprints, which circled the cabin before disappearing into the trees. Whoever it was had left in a hurry, but not before leaving something behind. A small, crumpled piece of paper. Henry picked it up and unfolded it. The message was short and written in messy handwriting. "Leave the bear alone. It doesn't belong to you." His hands trembled as he read the words. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. Someone had a reason for tying up the bear, and they didn't want Henry interfering. But why? What was so special about this bear? He hurried back inside, his mind racing. The bear was awake now, its dark eyes watching him intently. Henry sat down beside it, holding up the note. "Looks like you've got some enemies, big guy," he said. "But don't worry, I'm not going to let them hurt you." The bear let out a low grunt, almost as if it understood. Henry couldn't explain it, but he felt a strange connection to the animal. It was more than just pity. It was as if they were both caught up in something bigger than themselves. Over the next few days, Henry focused on nursing the bear back to health. He used his knowledge of wildlife to treat its wounds and fed it a mixture of fish and berries. The bear grew stronger, but it never tried to leave the cabin. It seemed to trust Henry, which only deepened the mystery. One evening, as Henry was preparing dinner, he heard a noise outside, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his heart pounding. The forest was quiet, but he could feel eyes on him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer, but as he turned to go back inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching him. It was too dark to see clearly, but the person was tall and wore a heavy coat. Before Henry could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest. Henry rushed back inside, locking the door behind him. The bear was on its feet now, its ears twitching as if it sensed danger. Henry sat down, his mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't going to give up easily. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to confront the person who was after the bear. But for now, all he could do was wait and prepare for whatever came next. The days turned into a tense, waiting game. Henry rarely left the cabin, and when he did, he made sure to carry his hunting rifle. The bear, now stronger and more active, stayed close to him, almost as if it sensed the danger lurking outside. The bond between them had grown stronger, but so had the mystery surrounding the bear's past. One afternoon, while Henry was chopping wood outside, he heard a faint sound, a low hum, like the rumble of an engine. He froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, and soon he saw a black SUV making its way down the narrow forest road toward his cabin. His stomach dropped. Visitors were rare in this part of the woods, and he had a bad feeling about this one. He hurried inside, locking the door behind him. The bear, sensing his unease, let out a low growl. "Stay quiet, big guy," Henry whispered, peeking through the window. The SUV stopped a few yards from the cabin, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in heavy jackets and boots, and one of them carried a rifle. Henry's heart raced as he recognized the taller man. It was the same figure he'd seen watching him from the trees. The men approached the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Henry grabbed his rifle and stood by the door, ready to defend himself and the bear. "Hello," one of the men called out, his voice deep and commanding. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Henry hesitated. He didn't trust them, but he also knew he couldn't hide forever. He cracked the door open just enough to see their faces. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The taller man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We're here for the bear," he said. "It's not yours to keep." Henry's grip tightened on his rifle. This bear was tied up and left to die. I'm not just going to hand it over to you. The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. That bear is valuable. It's part of a project. We need it back." "What kind of project?" Henry demanded. The men exchanged a glance, and the shorter one spoke up. "It's complicated, but trust me, you don't want to get involved. Just give us the bear, and we'll leave you alone." Henry shook his head. "Not a chance. You're not taking it anywhere." The taller man's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, old man. This isn't your fight." Before Henry could respond, the bear let out a deafening roar from inside the cabin. The men stumbled back, their eyes wide with fear. Henry took advantage of their shock and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. "Stay back!" he shouted through the door. "I'm warning you." The men didn't leave immediately. He could hear them talking in hushed tones outside, but eventually the sound of their footsteps faded as they returned to the SUV. The engine roared to life, and they drove away, leaving Henry and the bear in uneasy silence. Henry slumped against the door, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't over. The men would be back, and next time they might not be so polite. That night, as Henry sat by the fire, he noticed the bear acting strangely. It was pacing back and forth, its ear twitching as if it heard something he couldn't. Then, without warning, it stopped and looked at him. Its eyes filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The bear walked over to the corner of the cabin and began digging at the floorboards with its massive paws. Henry watched in confusion as the bear tore up the wood, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a small metal box. Henry's hands trembled as he picked it up. The box was locked, but the bear nudged it toward him, as if urging him to open it. Using a knife, he pried it open, revealing a stack of documents and a USB drive. The documents were filled with scientific jargon and diagrams, but one word stood out: Project Ursa. Henry's heart raced as he realized the bear wasn't just a random animal. It was part of some kind of experiment. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, and a video file popped up. When he clicked play, his blood ran cold. The video showed the bear in a laboratory, surrounded by men in white coats. It was being injected with something, and its roars of pain echoed through the speakers. Henry's hands clenched into fists. "What have they done to you?" he whispered, looking at the bear. The bear let out a low growl, its eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. Henry knew then that he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He had to uncover the truth about Project Ursa and protect the bear at all costs. Henry spent the rest of the night poring over the documents from the metal box. The more he read, the more horrified he became. Project Ursa wasn't just an experiment. It was a secret government program aimed at creating genetically enhanced bears for military use. The bear in his cabin, referred to as Subject 7, had been injected with a serum designed to increase its intelligence, strength, and aggression. But something had gone wrong. According to the notes, Subject 7 had shown signs of unexpected emotional development, including empathy and loyalty, traits the scientists hadn't anticipated. They deemed it a failure and planned to terminate it. That's why the bear had been tied up and left to die. It was supposed to disappear, along with the secrets of Project Ursa. Henry's hands shook as he closed the folder. He looked at the bear, now sleeping peacefully by the fire, and felt a surge of anger. How could anyone do this to an innocent animal? He knew he had to act fast. The men in the SUV would be back, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The next morning, Henry packed a bag with supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, and the documents from the metal box. He also grabbed his rifle and a map of the forest. If he could get the bear to a safe location, maybe he could buy some time to figure out his next move. "Come on, big guy," he said, gently nudging the bear awake. "We're going on a trip." The bear groaned, but stood up, its massive frame towering over Henry. It seemed to understand that they were in danger and followed him without hesitation. They set out into the forest, moving quickly but quietly. Henry led the bear to a hidden cave he'd discovered years ago during his photography expeditions. It was deep in the woods, far from any trails, and the perfect place to hide. As they approached the cave, Henry heard the distant sound of an engine. He froze, his heart pounding. The SUV was back, and this time it wasn't alone. 2 more vehicles followed, filled with men armed with rifles. "This way," Henry whispered, urging the bear to move faster. They ducked into the cave just as the vehicles came into view. Henry crouched behind a rock, watching as the men spread out, searching the area. One of the men shouted, "We know you're out here, old man. You can't hide forever." Henry's mind raced. He couldn't let them find the bear, but he also couldn't fight them alone. He needed a plan, and fast. The bear nudged him gently, as if sensing his fear. Henry looked into its eyes and saw something he hadn't noticed before. A glimmer of intelligence, of understanding. It wasn't just an animal anymore, it was something more. "All right, big guy," Henry said, his voice steady. "We're in this together. Let's see if we can outsmart them." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a remote-controlled camera he'd used for wildlife photography. It wasn't much, but it might buy them some time. Henry set up the camera on a tree branch near the cave entrance and activated it. The live feed appeared on his phone, showing the men searching the area. He waited until they were close, then triggered the camera's motion sensor. The sudden movement caught their attention and they turned toward the camera, their rifles raised. "Over there!" one of them shouted. As the men moved toward the camera, Henry and the bear slipped out of the cave and headed deeper into the forest. They moved quickly, staying low to avoid detection. But their escape wasn't easy. The forest was dense and the snow made every step a struggle. Henry's legs ached and his breath came in short gasps. The bear stayed close, its eyes scanning the trees for danger. Just when Henry thought they were in the clear, he heard a noise, a low growl that sent a chill down his spine. He turned and saw a massive wolf blocking their path. It was the same pack from before, and they didn't look friendly. The bear stepped forward, letting out a deep, rumbling growl. The wolf hesitated, its eyes flicking between Henry and the bear. For a moment, it seemed like they were at a standoff. Then, without warning, the bear charged. The wolf yelped and darted into the trees, the rest of the pack following close behind. Henry stared in awe. The bear had protected him, again. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Henry said, patting the bear's side. But there was no time to celebrate. The sound of voices echoed through the trees, and Henry knew the men were closing in. He and the bear had to keep moving. As they trudged through the snow, Henry's mind raced with questions. Who were these men? And how far were they willing to go to get the bear? And what would happen if they succeeded? One thing was clear: Henry couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone who could expose Project Ursa and put an end to it for good. But who could he trust? Henry and the bear pushed deeper into the forest, the sound of their pursuers growing fainter with every step. The snow had started falling again, covering their tracks and giving them a slight advantage. But Henry knew it wouldn't last long. The men from Project Ursa were determined, and they had resources he couldn't match. As they moved, Henry's mind raced. He needed a plan, but more than that, he needed allies. He thought about the few people he still trusted, old friends from his wildlife photography days, a park ranger he'd worked with years ago, even a journalist who had once interviewed him about his work. But reaching out to any of them would be risky. The men from Project Ursa were clearly well connected, and they might be monitoring communications. The bear suddenly stopped, its ears twitching. Henry froze, listening. At first, he heard nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. Then, faintly, he caught the sound of running water. "A river," Henry whispered. "If we can get to the river, we might be able to throw them off our trail." They changed direction, following the sound. The terrain grew rougher, with steep slopes and jagged rocks hidden beneath the snow. Henry's legs burned with effort, but he pushed on, driven by the thought of what would happen if they were caught. When they finally reached the river, Henry felt a flicker of hope. The water was partially frozen, but it was still flowing, cutting through the forest like a silver ribbon. If they could cross it, the men might lose their trail. "All right, big guy," Henry said, turning to the bear. "This is going to be tricky, but we have to try." The bear let out a low grunt, as if in agreement. Henry took a deep breath and stepped onto the ice, testing its strength. It held his weight, but he wasn't sure if it would support the bear. "Slow and steady," he said, gesturing for the bear to follow. They moved carefully, the ice creaking ominously beneath them. Halfway across, Henry heard a loud crack. He froze, his heart pounding. The bear stopped too, its eyes wide with fear. "Don't move," Henry whispered, but it was too late. The ice beneath the bear gave way, and it plunged into the freezing water. Henry's stomach dropped as he watched the bear struggle, its massive paws clawing at the slippery edges of the hole. "Hold on!" Henry shouted, dropping to his knees and reaching out. He grabbed the bear's fur, pulling with all his strength. The bear thrashed, its weight threatening to drag Henry into the water. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. Then, with a final, desperate effort, the bear managed to haul itself onto the ice. Henry collapsed beside it, both of them panting and shivering from the cold. "That was too close," Henry said, his voice shaky. The bear let out a weak growl, its fur dripping with icy water. Henry knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. Once they reached the other side of the river, Henry found a small, sheltered area beneath a cluster of pine trees. He quickly built a fire using dry branches and his lighter, and they huddled together, trying to warm up. As the fire crackled, Henry's thoughts turned to the USB drive and the documents he'd found. He pulled out his laptop, which he'd wrapped in a waterproof bag, and plugged in the drive. There had to be more information, something that could help him expose Project Ursa. He scrolled through the files, his eyes widening as he found a folder labeled Subject 7, Behavioral Analysis. Inside were videos and notes detailing the bear's progress in the program. One video showed the bear solving complex puzzles, while another showed it responding to commands in a way that seemed almost human. But the most shocking file was a video labeled Termination Protocol. Henry hesitated before clicking play. The video showed a group of scientists discussing the bear's failure and their plans to dispose of it. One of the scientists mentioned a backup plan, a second facility where other test subjects were being held. Henry's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about one bear. There were others, and they were in danger too. He looked at the bear, who was watching him intently. "We're not just saving you," he said. "We're saving them too." The bear let out a low growl, its eyes filled with determination. Henry knew what he had to do. He had to find the second facility and expose Project Ursa to the world. But first, he needed to get the bear to safety. As the fire died down, Henry heard a noise in the distance. A helicopter. His heart sank. The men from Project Ursa weren't giving up. "We need to move," he said, packing up his things. "They're getting closer." The bear stood up, its massive frame casting a shadow in the firelight. Henry could see the strength and intelligence in its eyes, and he felt a surge of hope. Together, they might just have a chance. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, its searchlight slicing through the trees like a blade. Henry and the bear moved quickly, staying low to avoid detection. The forest was dense, but the helicopter's light was relentless, sweeping back and forth in a methodical pattern. Henry's mind raced. They couldn't outrun a helicopter, and hiding wouldn't work for long. He needed a distraction, something to buy them time. "This way," he whispered to the bear, leading it toward a rocky outcrop he remembered from his photography days. The rocks formed a natural shelter, and if they were lucky, the helicopter wouldn't spot them there. They reached the outcrop just as the helicopter passed overhead. Henry pressed himself against the cold stone, his heart pounding. The bear crouched beside him, its breath visible in the freezing air. For a moment, it seemed like they were safe. Then the helicopter circled back, its searchlight lingering on the rocks. Henry held his breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. The light moved on, and Henry let out a shaky sigh. But the relief was short-lived. The helicopter didn't leave. It hovered nearby, as if the pilot suspected something. "We need to move again," Henry whispered. "But we have to be smart about it." He glanced around, his eyes landing on a cluster of dry bushes a few yards away. An idea formed in his mind. "Stay here," he told the bear, creeping toward the bushes. He pulled out his lighter and set the dry branches on fire. The flames spread quickly, sending a thick plume of smoke into the air. The helicopter's searchlight immediately shifted toward the fire, and Henry heard the pilot radioing for backup. "We've got a fire in the northwest sector. Possible sighting of the target." Henry hurried back to the bear. "Let's go. They'll be distracted for a few minutes, but we have to move fast." They slipped away from the rocks, moving deeper into the forest. The fire had bought them some time, but Henry knew it wouldn't last. The men from Project Ursa were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they found the bear. As they walked, Henry's thoughts turned to the second facility mentioned in the files. If he could find it, he might be able to expose the entire operation. But he had no idea where it was, and he couldn't risk using his phone or laptop to search for information. Then he remembered something. A map he'd seen in the documents. It had been marked with several locations, one of which was labeled Facility B. If he could cross-reference that map with his knowledge of the area, he might be able to find it. He pulled out the documents and spread them on the ground, using his flashlight to study the map. The bear watched intently, as if it understood what he was doing. "Here," Henry said, pointing to a spot on the map. "This is where we are now, and this," he traced a line to another marked location, "is where Facility B might be. It's about 20 miles northeast of here." The bear let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on the map. Henry couldn't explain it, but it felt like the bear was agreeing with him. "All right," Henry said, folding the map. "We'll head there, but it's going to be dangerous. Are you ready?" The bear stood up, its massive frame towering over him. It let out a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to say, "Let's go." They set off again, moving quickly but carefully. The forest was quiet now, the sound of the helicopter fading into the distance. But Henry knew the calm wouldn't last. As they walked, he noticed something strange. The bear was leading the way. It seemed to know exactly where to go, navigating the forest with an almost human-like sense of direction. Henry followed, trusting the bear's instincts. After several hours, they reached a clearing. In the distance, Henry saw a chain link fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it was a large, windowless building surrounded by guard towers. "That's it," Henry whispered. "Facility B." But before they could get closer, a voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "Stop right there. This is a restricted area. Turn back immediately." Henry froze, his heart pounding. They'd been spotted. The bear let out a low growl, its eyes fixed on the facility. Henry could see the determination in its gaze, and he knew there was no turning back now. "All right, big guy," Henry said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." Henry and the bear crouched behind a cluster of trees, studying the facility. The chain-link fence was topped with razor wire, and guards patrolled the perimeter with dogs. It seemed impossible to get inside, but Henry knew they had to try. "We need a distraction," Henry whispered to the bear, "something big enough to draw their attention away from the main gate." The bear let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as if it understood. Without warning, it turned and lumbered off into the trees. Henry watched in confusion, unsure of what the bear was planning. A few minutes later, he heard a loud crash from the other side of the facility. The guards immediately turned toward the noise, shouting into their radios. "We've got movement on the east side. Possible breach." Henry realized what the bear had done. It had created a diversion. Now was his chance. He sprinted toward the fence, using a pair of wire cutters from his bag to create an opening. He slipped through, staying low to avoid the security cameras. The facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant barking of dogs. Henry made his way to the main building, his heart pounding. He found a side door and used a key card he'd taken from one of the men in the forest to unlock it. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit and lined with cages. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cages were filled with bears, dozens of them, all in various states of distress. Some were pacing back and forth, while others lay motionless, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Henry's hands clenched into fists. He had to stop this. He pulled out his phone and began recording, capturing every detail of the horrific scene. He knew he had to get this evidence to the outside world. As he moved deeper into the facility, he heard a familiar growl. He turned and saw the bear, his bear, standing in the doorway. It had somehow found its way inside, and its presence seemed to calm the other bears. "Good job, big guy," Henry said, patting the bear's side. "Let's get them out of here." Together, they began opening the cages, freeing the bears one by one. The animals hesitated at first, but the presence of the larger bear seemed to reassure them. They followed Henry and the bear out of the building, their movements slow but determined. As they reached the fence, the guards finally realized what was happening. Shouts echoed through the night, and the sound of gunfire filled the air. Henry ducked, shielding the bears as best he could, but then something incredible happened. The bears, led by Henry's companion, turned toward the guards and let out a deafening roar. The sound was so powerful that it seemed to shake the ground. The guards froze, their weapons slipping from their hands. Henry took advantage of the chaos, leading the bears through the hole in the fence and into the forest. They moved quickly, disappearing into the trees before the guards could recover. By morning, they were deep in the wilderness, far from the facility. Henry collapsed against a tree, exhausted but relieved. The bears gathered around him, their eyes filled with gratitude. The bear, his bear, nudged him gently, as if to say thank you. Henry smiled, patting its massive head. "We did it, big guy. We stopped them." Over the next few days, Henry worked to release the bears back into the wild. Each one seemed to understand what he was doing, and they disappeared into the forest with a sense of purpose. As for Henry, he knew his work wasn't done. He sent the evidence he'd gathered to a trusted journalist, and within weeks, Project Ursa was exposed to the world. The facility was shut down, and the people responsible were held accountable. But for Henry, the real victory was seeing the bears roam free, their spirits unbroken. He had risked everything to save them, and in doing so, he had found a new purpose. Moral lesson. The story teaches us that courage, compassion, and determination can overcome even the greatest odds. Henry, an ordinary man, risked his life to stand up for what was right, proving that one person or one bear can make a difference. It also reminds us of the importance of protecting the innocent and standing against cruelty, no matter how powerful the oppressors may seem.